Okay, well, hello and welcome to Deep Dish Dialogues. I am Rebecca Gordon. I am the Culinary Projects Lead with the Arrell Food Institute and the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management. We are excited to welcome you today to Deep Dish Dialogues, which is exploring the science of bread and gluten development. And today is a very special event because it is also part of the OAC 150th celebrations. For those that may not know, the Ontario Agricultural College was established in 1874, and since then has been a huge force, not just in Ontario, but also internationally around teaching and educating students about agriculture and also important innovative research. So their program also has a lot of different specialties, from animal bioscience to plant agriculture to resource economics. And one of their features that we're going to be going through today is food science department is very popular in the Ontario Agricultural College. And so today we are showcasing one of the OAC's researchers, Dr. Iris Joye, here today. And just before we begin, I just want to let you know we do have a huge audience that are tuning in online today. And for those that may not know where we are in the Anita Stewart Memorial Food Lab at the University of Guelph, and it sits on the treaty lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. So in our jam-packed hour, we're going to be going through 4 different demonstrations. As I mentioned, we have Dr. Iris Joye, and I didn't introduce her before, but she is an associate professor at the University of Guelph in cereal chemistry and biochemistry. She combines her research expertise in cereal science with her knowledge in colloidal chemistry to improve dough and bread quality. So we're really lucky to have her here today. And joining her, we have Chef Matthew James Duffy. So we'll clap for that as well. So not only is he a University of Guelph graduate from the School of Hospitality, but he is also a local food enthusiast, a sourdough bread fanatic with over 15 years of industry experience. He's worked at Michelin-starred restaurants, world-class bakeries, pizzerias, and privately to the stars in pursuit of knowledge and dedication to the craft of cooking. He's also currently a professor of baking and pastry arts management at Centennial College in Toronto. And I am so excited that we have these 2 great brains and knowledgeable people today to get a little bit nerdy and talk about bread.
It's a bit like the only thing I know how to talk about is bread, so don't hype me up too much.
Okay. To be honest, I'm quite nervous about this event because I have no bread making experience and chemistry, and I've learned a lot. So I'm excited to see how everyone else does as well today, keeping up with things. So Matthew, do you want to start us off?
Sure,
You're going to do our first demonstration for us.
I should have probably grabbed a little measuring cup that works. So for the first demonstration, I'm going to make a 100% whole grain bread or whole cereal bread out of rye. The properties of rye are very different from the properties of wheat. So Iris will speak about this later, but wheat contains 2 proteins, gliadin and glutenin. One develops, they have different properties, but together they make gluten. And rye actually only contains gliadin, so it does have the rising properties, but not the strength. So as I mix this dough, keep that in mind. And later on, we're going to demonstrate what different protein strengths in different flours and how they can impact breads. Last night, I have 2 sourdough starters here. If you're not familiar with sourdough, this is a naturally fermented wheat, and this would be naturally fermented rye. Essentially, it's just rye and water. If you've ever made kombucha or yogurt, very similar idea. Last night, I took this, my rye starter. This is actually Shakira. Shakira is about 14 years old and has traveled the world with me, and the rye starter is from Shakira. So in the bowl here, I've got rye, water, and flour that was mixed last night at about midnight. I've also got some fresh milled rye that was milled this morning on this mill, and I'm just going to place it on top of the starter. And then I've got some salt here. This is Vancouver Island sea salt. And the reason I use this is it's filtered for microplastics before they make it. Sea salt has a very high contamination. I bake breads for my kids. I have a 3 and a 6-year-old, so I transitioned to that not long ago. Now this is probably gonna upset somebody out there, and someone's going to say that this doesn't work and you can't do that. But you can see the steam coming off here. This is boiling water. And if you've ever taken a bread class or read a book, they'll tell you that boiling water will kill the yeast. You can't do that. This goes against science. And I'm just going to demonstrate this because this is a very great place to start if you're looking to get into bread baking. It's very fast and easy. We have what's called pre-fermented flour in these types of breads, which means the flour that's fermented before you mix the dough. So that can come in form of poulish, biga, levain, which is essentially yeast and water and flour, or in this case, sourdough starter. So I'm just going to take this off so it doesn't make a mess there. And we're now going to pour the boiling water right over top of the grain. At this point, the yeast is dead. My demo is over. I'm going home. Iris. So what happens here is we have such a high percentage of pre-fermented flour. As we mix this together, the flour on top is going to buffer that temperature, and we're going to end up with somewhere, I didn't bring a thermometer, but if I had to guess, I'd say about 37 to 30. I think you knew. So you'd be about 37 to 38 degrees Celsius, which is actually quite good for this type of bread. Now, when we talk about wheat breads, you generally want to ferment them at a lower temperature, something between 28 to 26 degrees Celsius. But rye, we want quite high and fast. And this bread's actually going to go in the oven before you even leave this class, before you leave this, or hopefully. Is
that normal when you bake bread, or is this
No,
really
that's
rare?
not normal at all. But for this type of bread, it is. People during the pandemic, I don't have all day. There's a lot of memes out there of people who are stuck at home and all they can do is feed their starter. Well, this is, if that's you, this is where you want to start. So I have 2 bread tins here. You can see the breads that we've baked out of it. Now, when we talk about gluten in a moment, you're going to see how to stretch a dough. So if I take wet hands, you can see there's very little strength here. It's more of a batter, and it does not look like you could make a bread out of this. What we're going to do is use a wet dough scraper. The wet scraper will prevent the dough from sticking to your hands. And I'm going to place about half of this into the tin, which would be approximately 850 grams. So as I do that, this recipe was actually developed at the School of Artisan Food in Nottingham, England. And the reason it was developed was they make a cheese called Stilton. It's a raw milk Stilton cheese. The only place that you can get this in the world is on the estate. And this bread is meant to be paired with blue cheese, but the variation is you add pink peppercorns and prunes. I have a cookbook coming out next year, and in my book, the variation is with figs. So this dough is very versatile. You can add fried onions. You could add apples to this. What else have we done? Figs and pink peppercorns. Really whatever you want. And once you understand some basic rules of bread baking, you can kind of create your own formula. So we're almost done here. The next step is just to take this dough scraper, and with a wet scraper, we're just going to press this into the tin. I don't know if you can see that, but it's pretty simple. I mean, in this whole process, I think we've probably spent, I don't know, what are we at, like the 7 or 8 minute mark here? And I've been talking and demonstrating the whole time. So if you did this at home, maybe the first couple times takes you a bit longer, but ultimately this is a very simple product. As we go through the demo, I'll stop at one point and show you the ryes, and you can really see how effective this high percentage of rye is. What we've done with the boiling water is essentially we've pre-gelatinized the starches in the flour. So there's a method called tangjong where you cook flour and water together. It's very similar. And when you try the bread later, you'll see that texture. It's very soft and kind of pleasant to eat. Well, hopefully pleasant to eat. And so that's it. We've just made a bread in less than 7 minutes. The only thing left to do is I like to coat this with a bit of flour on top. For one, I find it very aesthetically pleasing, but the real purpose is that as this rises, you're going to start to see it crack. And once we get to about 6 to 8 pinholes, you'll see these little holes form. Time to bake. Would you set a timer for 50 minutes, please? My baking assistant, Helena's back there. She's the real brains here. I'm just baking the bread, but she sets it all up for me.
Okay, so that was really impressive that you made it through all of that. And I don't know, maybe if we go, I think we went through really quickly. So for those who are at home, can you just remind us what are the ingredients that are in there right now?
All that we have in here, so in this starter, there's rye flour, water, and it's just perpetuated. So essentially what you would do is you would take some of this out into a new bowl, mix flour and water, and that becomes your new starter. It's kind of a seed, or some people call it an inoculation, and depending on the percentages, it can get really scientific when we talk about the pH levels. Rye has what's called a buffer effect, so once you go under 3.8 on the pH scale, it actually won't read. So this is probably somewhere between 3.6 to 3.8. When you mix it into the dough, you're spiking that up, making it more towards the alkaline, and as it ferments, it gets more acidic. So once this goes in the oven, you'll taste that in these breads. Acidity can break down the gluten as well if you over ferment something, but it's a very simple flour, water, and salt.
Perfect.
As basic as it gets. Grown in Ontario, organic rye, a very simple bread.
It's great. Well, thank you. And so now I want to bring Iris into the conversation. Sure. So we brought you here today not only because you're amazing, but also because you have a lot of knowledge around gluten.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if you can share a little bit with us about what actually is gluten and walk us through it a little bit.
Okay. So I think the slide must be visible to the audience here as well. So what is gluten? So gluten is actually a protein which is very unique to wheat, and it has very unique properties, and it's also the reason why wheat flour is often used in order to make bread. So what it does is it's creating a little network, a protein network in your wheat flour dough that will help to rise the bread at the end, and I think we're going to go over some demonstrations that will show you how that works. But what I want to start off with is actually first talk a little bit about the two components, the main components that we have in wheat gluten. So in wheat gluten, we have both a glutenin and a gliadin. You can see here a demonstration of a person that is working with isolated glutenin and one with isolated gliadin. So what happens during bread making is you are going to hydrate the flour. That's also what Matthew just did. So he added water into the rye dough or into the rye flour in order to make a dough. Same would happen with wheat flour dough. So when you hydrate wheat flour, you also hydrate the proteins, and that triggers a network forming reaction between the glutenin molecules. Glutenin molecules are very large molecules, so they are very big proteins, probably the biggest or one of the biggest on Earth. And what they are going to do is they are going to form a network through certain very stable bonds. Next to glutenin and wheat flour, you also have gliadin. And gliadin is a smaller molecule. And what it's going to do, it's going to create an effect so the glutenin molecules can nicely shift, roll, shear over one another. So it kind of works as a lubricant into the wheat flour dough. The combination of both, so the strength of the gluten and then the lubricating effect of the gliadin, you need both of them in order to make a high quality bread. And here on this demonstration or on this side, what you can see is a person that is stretching glutenin. We're going to stretch some flours and some doughs later on as well in order to show you the effect. So glutenin is going to give you elasticity to your dough. The gliadin is giving you the viscosity. And the combination of both of them creates viscoelastic gluten, and that is what is shown here. Actually, what the illustration is really showing is that gliadin is something that you can make flow. So it doesn't create a network, it's really something that creates a viscous liquid. So when we are making a dough, so we have that viscoelasticity, that means that you can stretch a dough and then it will partially recoil, right? And that is the viscoelastic properties of your dough. Two things are there at the basis of why this happens, why the recoiling or the partial recoiling is happening. One of them is here shown in this figure. So these are two strands of glutenin. That's how you have to see those lines here. And in the relaxed dough, those strands are interacting to some extent. I'm not sure if this shows on the other side as well. So you can see there is interaction between those two strands of glutenin, and there are also loop regions. And when you are stretching out your gluten network, or when you are stretching out the wheat flour dough, you are going to flatten those loop regions. You can completely flatten them, and if you then leave it, so you relax the dough, it will basically start to recoil back into the loop regions. Something else that happens with gluten, which is also very unique, is that in those loop regions that you have here, so you have to look at these regions, you will actually have spiral structures. So they are called beta spirals here, doesn't matter. But those spiral structures, it works like a spring. So you can also extend it and it will recoil back. So this is where the elasticity from gluten, or glutenin at least, comes from.
in the bread making process, understanding that is extremely important. Elasticity versus extensibility. Depending on what type of bread you're making, you want higher elasticity, extensibility. That can come from hydration, from mixing and properties of the dough. But that, if for anyone that's watching trying to learn bread, that is what you need to. That's a big takeaway.
Yes.
Yeah.
And that's why people like Matthew, for example, are also experts, and they feel how much, for example, rye flour they can mix with a wheat flour in order to get certain wheat flour or rye flour properties. The last illustration here on this slide is actually an electron microscope image of a dough, just to show you how it would look like. So the little bowl-like spherical things that you can see are the starch granules, and then the matrix that looks like stretched films, that's actually your gluten matrix. And this is how an unfermented dough would look like if you stretch it out and put it under an electron microscope to see nanoscale structures.
With the structure of the dough, so with that in mind, essentially what I'm doing here, not as much so here, I guess, because of the lack of gluten, but when you're talking about wheat doughs, sort of like in this sourdough, the fermentation is going to, the wild yeast or yeast, if you're making yeasted bread, is going to consume the sugars and you're going to create CO2. That the goal is to get that trapped in the pockets of gluten in the web. And I think that that's something that's really big for people trying to learn, is you see these breads with an open crumb and these beautiful holes in the bread. But when you first start your journey, it's very difficult, and it's all because of what Iris has just explained, and understanding those properties is really going to elevate your baking and allow you to really sort of create awesome breads and really learn a lot and progress, versus just looking at flour and not really understanding what it is. So I think that concept that was just explained is extremely important, and it can help you unlock a lot of doors in your baking, even not breads, just baking in general.
That's great. So you mentioned you mentioned the word crumb.
Yeah.
For those who maybe aren't bakers and don't know what it
sure.
is, can you maybe explain what it is,
sure.
and
Can you
why
grab me the
it's
bread
important?
knife? Sure. Let's just actually show it.
Totally derailed our plans here. But
These are this bread is naturally fermented sourdough bread. It's made with about 85% hydration. The hydration baker's percentage, when we talk about flour, it's in relation to flour. So if you add 1,000 grams of flour, 83% hydration would be 830 grams. The volume is slightly less than you'd typically see in a bakery, but the reason is I like wet breads because they eat better, they keep better. As a bakery owner, I can make more money because the water is the cheapest ingredient in the bread. So when we talk about the crumb structure, we're actually talking about inside. So you have a ratio of crust to crumb. I mean, it's not particularly the most open bread there, but you can see it's pretty even crumb, and you've got some holes in there, and that's typically what we're looking for. And sometimes you might get these wild open holes, and sometimes it might be very tight, and depending on what your baking goals are, what your journey is, what stage you're at, you always hear people that are like, well, I don't like the big holes because the butter falls through, and other people are like, I want the big holes. But I think actually it's better to hydrate the breads properly, not because you're looking for a certain picture. Hydrating the flour, and when we talk about the next demo, that's hopefully going to help you understand why different flours can hydrate differently.
Yeah. So that's a perfect segue then into that next demonstration. So there's 4 different flours here that we're going to run through, and the hydration. So maybe let's walk through what flours we do have here.
So we have pastry flour, all-purpose bread flour, and whole wheat. All of these have a different protein or different strength. The other important thing to remember, I'm sure Iris could probably touch on this more, is not all protein is equal. So I did some breads some croissants for the bakery showcase as a demo, and we use T55, which is a soft wheat from France, but you get a high volume. So typically we think more protein, better volume, better water retention. But there's also quality of protein. So in Canada, we are very fortunate. We have really strong, very good wheat. However, it's not very good for making something like a croissant. So we would blend flours. You wouldn't, if you made a croissant with a bread flour, you would have limited volume. So these are mixed at 70% hydration. They're all the same. So we would have 100 grams of flour and 70 grams of water. They're mixed about an hour ago. In bread making, one would probably call this autolyse, which is a period of mixing them together and rest. The reason we mix them before is to have that relaxation period that Iris had talked about so that I can stretch it out for a demo. So if I take the pastry flour, you can see already it's kind of stretching like a pizza dough. And if I try to stretch this out, you get a pretty good window, but you see how quickly it breaks. Another thing to note, which is probably difficult for you to see, but the break is very jagged line. It's not a very smooth line. So when you're mixing doughs, you really want to develop, well, depending on the dough, but typically you want to develop it till that smooth break. Something that's very evident in a spiral mixer. So this pastry flour would probably be about 10.5% protein. The all-purpose would be 11.5, I'm guessing, and the bread would be 13 to 14. So already, can you see the difference there? It's much stronger. That one, I picked it up and it was like, wow. Get the wood oven out, throw a pizza in. This one, we can stretch it. You can probably see my face through there. Okay, I can read the words on the screen, but again, you can already see this starting to break, and it breaks. Now, if you ever are baking and you don't know your flour, you can start with this test, and then you get a better understanding of what you're working with. If you're following recipes online, it might not work. I have a very good friend who's a baker in the UK, phenomenal baker, and I can't really use his recipes because they have very weak flour. It's very different. So he sends me a formula and I have to really adjust it. So the last one here is our bread flour. This is our strongest protein. And if you see that, like, look at how well that can stretch. I can even put, from this side so you can see my fingers through that. And that's a good sign that this is a very strong flour. And I'll pull it till it breaks and the line is much cleaner the way it breaks. You see how it kind of comes down straight? And that's another sign that this is a well-mixed dough. And we didn't mix this on a machine. It was just mixed by hand in the bowl. I'll see. That's the one you're going to wash out, right?
Yes.
I didn't ruin it for you, did I? Okay. And then finally, this is whole wheat. So this is 100% whole wheat, which is hard red spring, which is a typical grain that you would get your bread flour from through extraction. We'll talk about milling later. And now, this is tough because we're talking about whole wheat, so it's not going to window the same. And I think Iris can probably touch on this, but a lot of bakers will tell you that the bran, which is the coarse part of the grain we'll discuss later, is actually going to shred the gluten because it's sharp. However, it's my understanding that that's not true. It's actually heavy. So as you have this pocket of gas that's rising, it's the bran weighing it down. So if you really want to make a whole wheat bread, you just need to mix it very well. And you can still get a nice open inside, whereas the typical understanding online or home bakers as well, it's like a balloon and it pops the balloon. That's actually not true. It has to do with the weight of the bran and the strength of the flour. Is that correct?
Sure.
Or do you have a different opinion?
Yeah, please.
We would love to get your background.
The dilution effect. So when you have whole grain, and I think we're going to go to that later, we have the bran in there, and so maybe some germ. So you do dilute the protein content. So it will be a little bit more diluted, which means that you would have more of a behavior that indeed looks like an all-purpose flour.
Okay.
And I, during the demonstration of Matthew, I'm not sure if you have seen it, like the first one, the pastry flour really behaves like the gluten, right? It almost is something that runs out, while the last one, the bread wheat flour, actually really shows you that elasticity.
Yeah, like when I pick that up, you can see that I don't even have to do anything and it's already... Wow.
So it will have a lower protein content, but it also will have a lower protein quality in terms of like how the glutenin is going to make that network structure, which is very important to uphold the bread and the dough structure.
So when you bake a bread with these different flours, you're going to have a different structure because of the gluten network. And then how do you figure out that right bread for what you're doing? And I don't know, what's your thought process there?
That's a good question. I think first you have to figure out what you have available. So I only work with organic flours. I have a bakery in my house. I have 2 little girls and they eat the breads and they live this life. And my wife's also a cancer survivor, so we eliminated a lot of things. I'm not saying that non-organic causes cancer or anything like that. I'm not a nutritionist, but in our family, that's our personal values. And so that's my first decision, is what kind of flour do I want to work with, what kind of wheat. I mean, if you said all I want to eat is whole grain bread, don't let me teach you how to make a wheat sourdough, like it doesn't make sense. So that's your first decision. The second is, what do you have access to? What can you get? Different flours cost more money, so maybe you're in a situation where you can only afford a cheaper flour, and there's nothing wrong with that. Go for it. Then you have to ask yourself, what are your goals in your baking? So when you work with bread flour, you typically get a larger volume, and you can put more water into the dough. However, you can still make sourdough with all-purpose. You would just hydrate it a bit less. The mixing process is a little bit different depending on where you are. During the pandemic, we were baking for a food bank downtown Toronto, and we had a flour mill donate all-purpose. I typically work with bread flour, and as I was folding the dough, which is a process of sort of stretching the dough to develop strength, my hands would just rip through the dough, and I could feel it as I was pulling. I couldn't quite figure it out. Then I looked at the bag and I looked at the specs from the mill and realized like this is a weaker flour, so you just have to treat it differently. Okay. So you sort of figure out, what are my baking goals? What am I trying to bake? If you want to bake panettone, for example, you need a super strong flour with a high extensible to elasticity, but also you need a good strong falling number because it's a long fermentation. So falling number is a test where you mix some flour and water in a tube, and it kind of, you do that in the lab, I'm guessing. And there's probably a lot of reasons you do that, but for me, the baker, the reason I want to know that number is it dictates the fermentation. So something for breads would be between 325 to 350. If you're baking panettone, you'd be up to like 400, maybe even 450. And maybe my numbers are probably not accurate, but it's okay. I'm a little nervous. I'm just a baker. I got a real expert here. So that's the first process you would go through. What are you baking? What do you want to bake? What recipes are you using? You know, if you want to make a cake, you would select your pastry flour. Yeah. But you can really do it with anything. I just don't think, maybe you can. I don't think you could really make a great sourdough out of pastry flour, but you can definitely do it with all-purpose. You can definitely do it with bread flour. You can do it with whole wheat. And then if you really want the ultimate, mixing and blending the flours, I think, is the best, really.
Yep, exactly. What you could also do is actually, you can buy isolated gluten, right? So if you have a suboptimal flour, for example, you can still add a little bit of that vital gluten in order to actually come to the dough strength you want.
In South America, I do some consulting, and that's typically what I recommend, because in Brazil, they don't get a very good quality flour, so I always recommend a vital gluten. Do you have a percentage that you would add for recommendation, or you would base it off the flour first?
Actually, okay. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And then, so I'm going to throw you for another different question. I've heard that you're a home baker, bread baker.
Mm-hmm. During the pandemic.
Yeah. Okay. What would you go for as your flour choice? And
so the base is also always a bread flour, right? Mm-hmm. We do like to mix in different amounts of the whole meal in order to, because nutritionally, it's better actually to eat the whole wheat bread, right?
Tastes better. Tastes better too.
Yes, that's true. Well, kids do not always agree with that.
Depending.
I think it's a richer flavor for sure, and it does add dietary fiber, which is going to be very low in the refined wheat flour. So that is something.
Okay, that's good.
That I would recommend.
So we went through 4 different flours here. Earlier, we were mixing with rye flour for the first demonstration. Is rye a wheat? Or what is the difference between them?
So rye and wheat are both cereals. So they are basically grasses that we grew centuries, very long, right? And we optimize it in order to give us a high yield. Rye and wheat are not the same, so wheat really has the unique properties of the gluten. Rye, as Matthew already said, has one of the components which is way more prevalent than the other one in the flour, and as such it will not make you the same, like what Matthew just demonstrated with the stretching. You will not be able to do that with the rye dough. So wheat is unique because of the gluten, because of the perfect balance that you have between gliadin and glutenin, and the strength of the glutenin that comes with it. So no, it's not the same. What needs to be said, however, although you may know people that are living with celiac disease or non-celiac gluten sensitivity, being said that wheat is not rye is also not safe for people that are living with celiac disease, right? So rye, barley should not be used.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but it's gliadin that celiacs react to, correct?
Yes,
so
exactly.
If you have rye with gliadin, they can't eat it. And then what about, I've have some celiacs that can eat 100% spelt bread, but it does have gluten. And do you know anything about, is it a different type of gluten or?
So for spelt breads, it's actually also not recommended to eat.
Or they're just lying and they're like, yeah, this is lying.
I don't know.
I'm a celiac. I live in California. Everyone's a celiac.
So I would not eat any of the grains that have a crease, and I think we're going to pass on some wheat kernels later on.
Okay.
So you will see that they have, and we also have an illustration how a wheat kernel looks like. So a few of the cereals have a crease: rye, barley, oats. Spelt, sure.
Okay.
Wheat as well. The only of those cereals that for now is presumed to be safe for people that are living with celiac disease is actually oats. But you have to make sure that they are certified gluten-free because contamination with wheat in an oat batch happens very quickly. There's very similar kernels as well. So
That's really good to know. Well, thank you. I think now we should maybe move into your demonstration now, which is kind of a segue into washing out. And
Yes.
can you explain what you're doing and what you're demonstrating?
So I'm going to take the bread wheat dough because that one had the highest strength, as you could already see before, right? I didn't wet my hands, so now I'm stuck with it. What we are going to do, so this has gluten in it. So as Matthew already said, around 13% of the flour would have been the protein, right? And around 80% of that would actually be your gluten. So let's say that there's around 11% of the flour that is in here is actually gluten. You can wash this out, and this is a great activity if you ever have an activity or you have like a dead afternoon with kids. This is a great activity. My kids love it very much, not anymore because I let them do it too much now. But what you do, you make a wheat flour dough and then you just basically submerge it in water, and you can gently, not too hard, but stretch it and squeeze it out. You can immediately see that there's white stuff coming out. That white stuff that is coming out is your wheat starch. There will also be some soluble components that will come into the water. And you can do this. This is also something really messy that kids really like, right? It sticks everywhere. It's your house very dirty. But you keep on doing that, and eventually what you will be ending up with is a gluten mass. So this can take a while, and that's why for this demonstration, we actually already, I will leave this here because you will see the starch sink out in the material. But for this demonstration, so one of the researchers in my lab actually already made a gluten mass yesterday, which had been resting in the fridge for a while. And what you would be able to get out of a wheat flour dough like that is actually a gluten mass. So this is basically the isolated gluten, so that is present in your wheat flour dough, and that is also what gives you the properties in order to make a high quality bread. So as you can see, it's even more stretchy than the bread wheat flour dough that we had before. So you can really stretch it out, it doesn't break anymore, right? So this is almost pure gluten.
I gotta do this for my kids. They love it.
They will, they will, I promise.
Yeah,
you.
they were getting into the doughs last night, and I was like, I need this for a demo.
Well, if you have some leftovers, you can also do it
we'll
with the pastry one, but it will be not as strong as this one, I think.
So when I visited Cereals Canada, they had a machine. You do this, you put it in, it blows up a balloon, Chopin alveograph. Could you explain that a little
That's
bit?
what I'm going to illustrate now.
Okay.
So we don't have the machine here, so I will be the machine. But what we are going to do, so why this is fun to do with kids is because you can actually make balloons out of this gluten ball. So I hope it works. I tried it before. You all came in, so I hope it still works. So what you do is you basically put a slab of gluten on your hand, then you fold it over, and you're gonna try to close it as good as possible around the straw. And then what the device would be doing is indeed it would be blowing in air, and it would basically blow a bubble out of the dough. It tells you something about the dough strength and the extensibility. So both of them are important, as Matthew already mentioned, for your bread quality. So what we are going to do, and again, it's possible that it doesn't work. I'm going to be the machine, so I'm going to blow in air, and you will see that hopefully there will be a balloon formed here.
Ooh.
I gotta do it. I gotta show my kids.
It's too late.
I have to show my kids that.
Let's try again. I'm not sure if
Okay, one more time. Now let me know. How big can it go?
No more plastic balloons at
No more
birthday.
plastic balloons.
Just gonna blow up a bunch of gluten balls in my house.
This is on a macro scale what actually happens during fermentation. So if it would have been a wheat flour dough that we were looking at, so the yeast or the sourdough is going to create carbon dioxide. So more and more of that gas will come into the wheat flour dough, and it will migrate into the gas cells that are already there, and the gluten will form a film on a much smaller scale than here, of course, and will hold the gas in the dough. And that's what it's going to give you the high, there you go, the high volume of a bread. So
Okay.
by better retaining your carbon dioxide.
Okay.
Very cool.
That's great.
Not to change the subject, but just to show you really quickly, it may be hard to see, but you can see my dough's already risen and the flour's starting to crack on top, and we're probably approximately 20-ish minutes in, I would say, maybe 30, 20. Just looking at the dough, I'd say 20, but just something to note as we carry on. So you can really see what's happening in this dough versus we mix a dough and wait for 4 hours of bulk fermentation, and everyone's sitting here like, what is this guy doing?
Okay, so that's great. So that was really interesting then. So we have a background on gluten development. We now understand about the bubbles and the volume. Maybe let's go back to the very beginning and talk about the composition of a grain.
Sure. Yeah, I'll pass these out.
Yeah? Okay. So Iris has, again, another slide for us to demonstrate. And we'll have you walk us through it then.
Sure. So this is a drawing, as you can see, of a wheat kernel and how it would look like. So you're passing it around. Actually, on top of the wheat kernel, you cannot see it with your eyes, I think, but there are little hairs, as you can see. I'm not going to talk about those hairs anymore. But what I want to highlight, I'm not sure, can I use it in order to...
Oh, sorry.
Oh, there we go. So when I was talking about the crease, where are we?
That's good.
This is the crease, right? So this would be when you make a cross section of those kernels. This is the crease. Actually, what happens here is there are a lot of microorganisms that are hiding in there, and that's one of the reasons why it's probably not such a good idea to eat flour raw, right? That's why most of the bakery products are baked. So
Don't eat raw cookie dough.
Yeah, keep that in mind. Because there are microorganisms, they hide in here. Although during the milling process, the idea is to remove the outer layers. If you want to make refined flour, it's very difficult to actually get rid of what is here in the middle of your kernel. So it usually does spoil it into the refined wheat flour. This is where your microorganisms are that are difficult to remove. They actually end up in your flour, and that's why don't eat raw cookie dough. But this is how a wheat kernel would look like. So we have a germ here. This is the start of a new plant. If you would put it in your soil, right, you would actually have wheat flour growing out of those kernels. And then during the milling process, what we want is we want to separate the germ from the bran. Bran is the outer, like darker colored layers here, and from the endosperm. And the endosperm is a very rich white thing you have here in the middle, and that is very rich in starch as well as in gluten. So I think Matthew is going to demonstrate later on a milling process. This one is not going to separate out your endosperm from the bran and the wheat germ, so you would make the more healthy whole grain flours here that we would recommend you to use in order to do home baking. But for the white flour, so it really has a very high concentration of what is here in the middle that has the highest amount of molecules and components that would actually give you or provide you the calories, right? So starch is there. There's some protein as well. Regarding the protein, so the protein is very functional, as you have seen in all the demonstrations thus far. Nutritionally, wheat flour protein is not a very good protein because it lacks some of the essential amino acids, and one of them is lysine. So make sure that you always balance it out with something that has a better amino acid profile.
Okay. Well, thank you for running that through for us so we understand the grain a little bit better. And then, Matthew, can you walk us through the actual process of milling? And,
Yeah, sure.
And what do you go through?
I'm just going to check one thing really quickly. We're going to slice up some samples. Just want to make sure that's all good. You all good? It's hard to cut.
We lost our chef for a quick minute here.
Yeah, you can both do it if you can, but that's fine.
One of my things that I was really excited about having Matthew demonstrate is the milling. Is that not a lot of people have maybe seen it. For me, I worked in a bakery, not baking, but I just like have that constant noise of it.
It's very loud, yeah.
It's very loud. And it's exciting though. So I'll let you walk us through it.
With this type, so at the college we have a New American Stone Mill, first college in North America to be milling whole grains on campus. We brought that over in 2019, I believe. So all the whole grains we use in the artisan bread program we mill in-house. Now, I also mill grains at home. Typically what I do is I mill softer grains like rye or spelt. Now, I know she just told you not to eat the wheat, but if you actually took a grain and bit it, the harder wheat actually has a harder bite, and that typically means a stronger protein and it'll absorb more water. Not always, but mostly. And then if you bit a spelt, it would kind of melt in your mouth. do so at your own risk. The other thing that I wanted to say was for anyone out there watching from the US, the proteins of flour in Canada are rated a little differently. So if I'm saying 13%, yours might be very different. So don't get mad at me. Now, with this type of mill, essentially what there are is you've got two stones inside, and they have a series of grooves in them. So it's probably hard to see, but you can see that little stone, and it's got a groove. A larger mill would have a lot more grooves. And what's happening is the grains goes into the hopper, lands in the stone's rotating. Typically, it's just the top one that moves, and as it pulsates, this is very coarse or gritty, and it sort of breaks open the grain. It pushes to the groove, and it comes out. This is called short milling. Everything that goes in is going to come out. When we talk about longer milling or osti-roller, you have a series of roller mills. So think of big wheels, very small because the grain's small, but for demonstration. And the grain goes through, and you're stripping away the outer layers until you get to that endosperm. And they actually have a vacuum that sucks out the bran. So you would see it. Is that pretty accurate? Sucks out the bran. And then what will happen in the grocery store is you go in and buy whole wheat flour. It looks kind of white with these big brown flecks in it. Now that's because it's been extracted and added back, and they decide in a lab, or the company decides what percentage, how much they want, whereas this looks very different. Now when you mill flour like this, to me it actually smells kind of like bread, and you should feel a little bit of oiliness to your fingers when you touch the grain. If you buy flour from the grocery store whole wheat and smell it, often it has the smell of rancid nuts. So if you've ever had like almonds, walnuts that have been sitting too long, they have that, and that's the germ that's been going rancid. So on this mill, when you turn it on, you have different coarse settings. So the first thing I can do is just put in some grains, and essentially what I've done is I've just made cracked wheat. So when you buy cracked wheat at the store, you can do this. If I wanted to incorporate this into a bread, I would pour boiling water on this the night before using. Typically I do 2 to 1, so 2 parts water, 1 part grain. That softens the grain. You can mix that into your dough. For baker's percentage bread nerds, I do between 30 to 35% soaker to bread. So you could incorporate that here. You could do cornmeal, cracked rye, cracked wheat, whatever you want, which will typically increase the nutritional value and density of the bread. I'll pass that around. I encourage you to, if you're comfortable with it, I know maybe don't eat it, but you can feel it in your fingers, and it kind of feels oily. You can also smell it. It smells like bread. Now with this mill is a little different. This is a home mill. I'm going to actually close this until it starts to click. And so when you buy this mill, you're like, oh no, what have I done? I shouldn't be doing that. But it actually, you want it to be clicking, and what's going to happen is there's a spring. When the grain goes in, it's going to push out a little bit. If you're milling a large quantity, I would freeze the grain first, because this will generate some heat, which I'm assuming degrades the protein probably. I thought so. So once you put it in, now, the finer the flour, the better water absorption it's going to have, which seems backwards. When you talk about a cracked grain that's going around, you typically need to add a boiling water or soak it for a longer period of time. When you feel this one, if you rub it between your fingers, you should feel that oiliness to it. And when you look at it, it doesn't really look like you'll see it when I pass it around, it doesn't really look like flour with brown flecks. It just looks like flour. If you add water to this, you're going to end up with something like that very dark color. And I'm not saying that you have to mill your own flour. This is better. It's more of a demonstration purposes. There's time and place for both. For a long time, I milled all my grains for bread, but I have a book coming out and I publish recipes online, and most people don't have the access. So I started buying whole wheat because I realized they act differently. If I mill this flour here, I bought some whole wheat from the store and I milled some whole wheat at school on the large stone mill. They would all have different water absorption properties. The one on the New American stone mill, I can push my hydrations up to between 90 to 95%. If I mix this, let's say 30% whole grain, so 700 grams of bread flour, 300 grams of whole wheat, and I put 90% whole water, it would be like your pandemic nightmare. You were trying to make sourdough at home and it didn't look like the website that you were following, and you were texting people and what's going on. And that's one of those reasons why, which all comes back to what Iris had said about the strength of the protein. So if I pass this around, you can just kind of feel it. You can feel free to smell it. It's a very great way to incorporate more whole grains into your baking at home. I know we're talking about bread, but something like a cookie, we make cookies with fresh milled wheat. Now, most people in here, I'm guessing, if you drink coffee, you probably have either a machine or a grinder at home and you grind your coffee. 20 years ago, nobody was grinding coffee at home. It just wasn't a thing. You would go to the store, you'd put it in, it would grind the coffee for you. So the moment you crack that grain open, you're exposing it to moisture, oxygen, and the quality starts to degrade the moment it's milled. When we want to preserve it, the grain will keep longer than the flour, so that's one of the reasons I like to mill it. Same like coffee, the terpenes in the coffee, you crack it open, you can smell it it's very strong. But if you mill coffee and then smell it a week later, it goes down. Now, Iris could probably speak to this a little bit more. There is a period of aging or oxidizing flour, which is typically done with, you'll see bleached or unbleached flour. Now that's something that's usually done chemically because these large mills don't have space and time to age things for multiple weeks. I found that when I'm working with fresh milled whole grains, I can use them right away. Between day 3 to 10, they perform a little differently. And then after 10, they're usually better. So I try to use it either right away or after. But I've also used it in day 3 and 5. I've got 2 little kids and I'm not planning 7 weeks out of my life. I'm trying to just manage children. So does that sound pretty accurate as far as?
It does. Yeah. So flour does go through a maturation process, right? So from the moment you milled it up, it got exposed to oxygen, which is actually going to affect how your protein is going to form a network. And it's true, there's a period where it's really unpredictable to use. So usually I think 10 days of maturation is something that would be accurate to actually have predictable processing quality of your flour.
Okay.
I'll often get questions about using a KitchenAid attachment or a food processor, and you can definitely mill flour, but when you mill a grain, you're actually damaging the starch, and the level of damage depends on how you mill it. So if you food process a grain, you could probably make some cookies out of it, but I wouldn't try to make bread out of it because you're really just killing the quality of the flour. It's just not very good. You may see there's one called a grain maker. It's this old mill and you crank it and it's like supposed to make really good flour because there's no heating or whatever. So
yeah, that's great. So then I don't know, there's all these different things that we've kind of gone through today that can affect the quality of bread, from I guess the hydration levels to the type of the flour and the grain and just so many different things, and I'm getting like a little bit panicked. I'm like, am I ever going to be able to produce bread? How do you try to standardize bread recipes? I
start
guess.
Here.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll try that one out. But how when you are creating a recipe, say for your cookbook, is there a way to make sure that it's more replicable for people? And then do you work on a larger scale, or what do you see in your research?
So we make small breads, right, in our lab. So our research actually in our group is looking a lot at gluten replacement, which is very difficult. But if we are making breads, we make them on 100 gram scale. So they are very small. And we have a standardized procedure that we use.
100 grams is the bread?
Yeah.
Okay.
No,
that's
100 gram flour. So the bread is a little bit
that's
more.
That's like a 3 Michelin star bread. They bring the little tiny breads out.
Something like that,
yeah.
But we have a very standardized procedure.
Okay.
So we want to see if there's an effect of a certain additional ingredient on bread loaf volume, for example, and the crumb structure and the hardness and so on. So we need to do it in a consistent way, because besides the flour and the hydration level and the ingredients, also how much you handle the dough, especially for a wheat flour dough, will affect how big your flour or how big your dough eventually and your bread will be.
Okay.
I typically see, just to expand on that point, I do a lot of troubleshooting and I get questions all the time, and I typically see a lot of undermixed doughs, and somebody out there published a book or an article online that was like, don't knead your dough, don't mix it, it's the best thing ever. It's actually, in my opinion, not the best thing ever. Yes, you can make bread like that, but when you're working with wheat like this, you actually do need to go through a mixing process, and that can happen through relaxation and stretch and folds or initial mixing, but that's a very big thing that happens in consults. I do consulting for bakeries and restaurants, and typically the doughs are very undermixed. I mean, the dough right there is mixed for about 20 minutes on a very aggressive spiral mixer, and most people, when I show them that in the demo, they're like, what? I only mixed for 3 minutes. But can depend on the flour, the hydration, the strength of the protein. There's many factors, but that's one right there. When I'm developing recipes for home, the process is pretty crazy, to be honest. I've published over 200 recipes. I have a book with 100 recipes coming out next year. And I mean, there's a lot of trial and error that goes through it. I also have a little bit of the like perfectionism sort of. So like I want the breads to be really approachable for home baker. And sometimes that language is where I complicate it because I'm using terms that are in my learning blind spot. Like autolyse, I might say that, and probably some of you that bake bread know that, but if you've never baked, you have no idea, and I forget to explain that, so that's, for me, important. The other one I think that is, I guess, good and bad. The good is that you can access anyone at any time. The bad is that you look online, you go on Instagram, you see all these breads, and you start to compare your bread to someone else's, but you ultimately have to understand that this is a craft and a skill, and it takes years of repetition. And I'm not saying you can't bake a good bread your first bread, but people bake a bread, and then they're like, I don't know what, this happened in the pandemic. I would get questions. Here's my bread. What did I do wrong? It doesn't look like yours. And my first question is, how long have you been baking? And they would say, 10 days, 2 weeks. Well, that's your problem. You just need to repeat the process. Iris has handled a lot of dough. She picks it up and stretches it out. Same here. Some of you would probably pick it up, it'd be stuck everywhere, and it just takes that practice repetition. So simplifying the process, I always try to explain the percentages. I think that's the best real way to elevate your baking and to understand what's happening. Getting away from cups and using a scale and understanding the percentages and what they do in the dough. So if you make a bread today at 70% hydration, tomorrow you can make it at 72, then 74, then 75. But if you're just kind of going in blind, you'll never really be able to track your process in your baking. So having a little workbook, a notepad, a sheet, and then when I develop the recipes, I try to just make that very clear and break it down. And what I do is I actually have some testers in my network, and I send them the recipes and they work through it, and then they hopefully pass. We did a sourdough starter recipe for my book, and I had a bit of a panic of, well, what if it doesn't work and all these people are going to buy this book? And so I sent it out to 50 of my newsletter readers, and 49 of them were successful, and the one that wasn't had the lid off. And that was my fault because it was explained in the front matter, not in the exact recipe, and she showed me a picture. And so like that for me is important, but I mean, it's bread. Like, don't be afraid to fail. You make a mistake, you're just going to eat it. Like, when I pulled this bread out of the oven, I did an event on Tuesday, and I let it ferment till Wednesday in the fridge, so the volume's a bit down. If I didn't tell you that, no one would even notice but me. So you're at the end of the day, you're going to eat it, you're going to slice it up. Like, who cares? You make a mistake, whatever. Now, there are some mistakes that I've made that have not been edible, and it does happen, but for the most part, you're going to eat it and enjoy it, right? So I think that's part of the process. You just have to fail, you have to learn, you have to get better, you try it again. The other one that I would recommend, I would think you probably would feel the same here, is when you get into baking bread, you're all excited and you go to your local flour mill and you buy 5 kilos of spelt, 5 kilos of whole wheat, 5 kilos of rye. You go home and then you bake a brownie, a croissant, a bread, and you're just changing everything. Just buy one flour, bake through the whole bag, understand what it does, and then go to the next. So that could be 70% bread flour, 30% rye. Make that 5 times, make that 10 times. Hey, I'm ready to add inclusions to my bread. I think I can put walnuts now. What do I do? I'm like, well, you've made this once, so like make it a few times and understand that you have to do that, That's not really how I develop the recipe. That's an advice, I guess.
I have a lot more confidence now. That was the pep talk I needed.
Honestly, you can add, so Helena's been, she's been baking with me since, 2020? I make mistakes all the time. Ask her. Like, I mess things up, but that's part of the process of developing a recipe. And once you have that formula down, you can just repeat it forever, and you always will have that bread, and there's nothing like it. There's nothing like pulling it out of the oven. It's that smell, that crust. It's beautiful.
Oh, exciting. So we have about 5 minutes left. Before we do the big reveal, I just wanted to come back to you, Iris. And earlier you mentioned you're doing a lot of work right now on trying to figure out gluten replacement.
Yep.
Can you maybe talk us through a little bit of that, or?
Sure. So we do have some research going on in order to see if we can make gluten-free recipes. So it's very easy to actually mimic what gliadin is doing in a dough. So viscosity is not the big issue. If you look at gluten-free doughs, you will see that they have a lot of gums in there. So xanthan gum may be one of them, or there are a few other ones. that they added into the recipes in order to actually get something which is very viscous, but it's almost like a cake batter in this case. So you do have carbon dioxide that is going to be produced as well. It's retained in the structure because of the viscosity, not because of the film-like properties that I just demonstrated here for the gluten. So what we are doing is we're also looking for replacements of gluten, and what we have been looking for is actually the protein that you can find in corn, so zein. If you mix it above 40 degrees C, it also will make you a viscoelastic dough structure. So the dough looks very similar. When we bake it into a bread, however, it does lose its gas holding capacity, so we need to add additional ingredients in order to actually keep the gas in there. But what it does, and I don't have an illustration of that, so gluten I've shown you forms the film-like structures. With zein, what we found is that it's more like fibrillar structures that you get, so it's way easier, I think, for the gas to actually escape the matrix. So we're doing that. We're doing a lot of structure-function relationships. We're looking at different ingredients that we can add into gluten-free recipes, keeping in mind that we want to make them healthy as well, because gluten-free products are usually a little bit more expensive than the regular wheat-based products. Quality depends. Some of them are really good, some of them are a little bit less. But also nutritionally, there's still a lot of work to do, because the gums that are added in, they're typically a little bit lower in protein. Protein quality is not very high, so there's a lot to do still there in product development. So.
Well, thank you for doing that work, though. Like, I think we're all hoping for better quality products, and you're doing some of that. So thank you.
There's a baker, one of my mentors. He runs a school in the south of France, which is, for any bakers watching, the ultimate baker's journey. I highly recommend. It's expensive, but I was actually there a year ago today. And he's opened a couple gluten-free bakeries, but they don't say gluten-free bakery anywhere. He's just doing good products, good quality ingredients, and it's good bread. So they don't advertise as gluten-free, but it is. He's got one in Marseille and one in Paris. But if anyone wants that information, I can send it out, because I think it's really cool to be into to learning about that. This is actually ready for the oven. I'll come around and show, and I'm actually going to bake these off in here. But you can see, you can pass it, just don't bang it. But you can see that it's cracked on top. And if you look closely, you'll see what I call a pinhole. And we're looking for about 6 to 8. How much time has it been on the timer? 4 minutes left. 46 minutes. I said about 50 by the time we get around, 50 minutes in the oven. So that's actually pretty good timing. But you can see, I'll start over here. You can kind of see those little pinholes. Now, if you go too far on this dough, what'll happen is when you cut it, you'll have this little roof here because it doesn't expand in the oven. And if you don't go far enough, you'll have this very wet bottom, this very raw bottom. Did you slice up some of the breads already? Should we pass out some
Yeah, we can
bread?
pass it around to everyone to try.
So we have some rye bread and some wheat bread that we've cut up. Please try it. I didn't bring any butter or cheese, but I really recommend you try it on its own and understand. And if you want to do it properly, go light to dark. Eat the wheat bread first, then the rye bread. The rye bread has quite a strong acidity and depth of flavor, so it'll affect the palate a little bit.
Okay. That's great. And so now, I think, like, as we come to the end of our time, it's getting a little louder because everyone's excited to see the bread. Iris, where could people learn more about some of the work that you're doing, do you think?
So we have a website. I work here at the University of Guelph, so you can look me up in the food science website, I think. My email address, I think, will be shared as well with the people that are here. And we do have a website that you can access through the webpage on the food science department. And there we have an overview of all the research we're doing.
That's great. Thank you. And then, Matthew, if people wanted to learn more about what you're doing.
So I teach full-time at Centennial College. We are actually in the process of developing what will be Canada's first postgraduate artisan bread program, and it'll be geared towards opening small bakeries with the focus on sustainability, local grains. So that's where you can find me. And then I have my own bakery and baking studio. I'm in Stouffville, Ontario. I do have a bunch of socials and website and all that, but the best place if you really want to learn, and the thing that I'm most proud of, is I send a weekly newsletter. I'm about to cross 14,000 readers. In the day and age of short form 30-second videos, I decided last year to go the opposite direction, and I'm writing really in-depth articles about things like today and things that are happening in my life with the goal of educating bakers around the world and sort of building that network. So if you really want to find me, that's probably the best place. And if you join the newsletter, I'll direct you to all the best things, the YouTube, the website, and all of the best articles and recipes. And I would love to see you as a reader. People reach out with questions, and I answer questions in the newsletter all the time. We feature some guest bakers, products, speakers, and stuff like that.
That's great.
Man, we have to do an article together if you're open to it. These are going to go in the oven real quick. I'm going to throw them in now. We bake these breads with steam, and I'm just going to pour some steam in the oven. It's that one, right? And I'll take this.
This?
Yeah, this is good enough. I think it's this one. So I typically put these in the oven at about 500 degrees, and then what we'll do is we'll lower the temperature. In an oven like this, you open the door, the temperature is going to drop a lot. So we always shoot higher, put the bread in, and then adjust the temperature. I also don't know this oven. I don't work in here, so I shot it a bit higher. I probably should have adjusted the rack there before I did this. That was my mistake. So I'll just take this out and then I'll throw them onto here. So I'm going to just throw them onto the rack. And then, sorry about this, but probably not the best thing for the oven. And this is very hot, so I'm going to put it here. Oh, sorry. And then we're going to just adjust this to 450. And we'll bake this for about 24 minutes with steam. Then I'll open the oven to vent out the steam and finish it. When you're talking about wheat breads, the steam is going to be what allows it to rise to its full potential. So you cut the bread with a razor or a knife or whatever, the steam dissipates, lands, the bread expands in the oven. So as we land the plane and I start to pack up, the breads will come out and you'll go home with a fresh baked bread.
Well, thank you. And so I think that we've come to the end of our time. So I want to say a huge thank you to you, Iris, for sharing all your knowledge and your research. Thank you, Matthew, as well, for doing a lot of our demonstrations and giving us a bit of a baker background. I really enjoyed today's event. Yeah, you're welcome. I enjoyed today's event. I hope that you all learned lots as well, too. Today's event, Deep Dish Dialogues, is organized by the School of Hospitality, Food and Tourism Management and also the Arrell Food Institute at the University of Guelph. Again, it was a really special part of our celebrations for the OAC 150th. They have lots more events coming up as well, too, so I encourage you to check them out. And our next event for Deep Dish Dialogues will be on June 27th, again in partnership with the Ontario Agricultural College, kind of looking at farm-to-table and local food procurement, so keep your eyes open for that. And also, just on one little final note, it's also my last Deep Dish Dialogues here that I've been organizing. It's been a pleasure to be a part of it. This was our 20th event that we ran. It's been going on for over 2 years. And I've enjoyed spending all my time with our audiences, all of our different guests, and I can't wait to kind of hand it over and see what it becomes in the future. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon.